But anyway, I want to conclude the 118th Psalm. I didn't get a chance to finish the conclusions. If you look back in the 118th Psalm that we finished last week, number one, we have the house of God with closable openings. Now, as I showed you, the gates, they mentioned gates. That doesn't really mean gates in the sense that we think of gates. That's, the translator has made, what do you call it?
Poetic
license. Yeah, poetic license, interpretive license. Literally it means a closable opening, which could be a curtain, which could be in the tabernacle. Because they're really, although I'm going to argue that it's probably likely the temple, could be the temple, you know, still it's the tabernacle, could be the tabernacle that the 118th Psalm is talking about. The sacrifice, you know, it talks about sacrifice pretty extensively in that psalm. There's a lot of euphemistic work and as well as non-euphemistic. I was really surprised because they threw in that that in about binding the sacrifice to the altar at the end of the 118th Psalm, which I don't remember if that was in the NIV because I don't remember it directly in that, and it's not exactly the way the King James looks at it. And I think they inverted a verse, which is cool. They do that a lot because depending on which text you're looking at, a lot of times you have inverted verses. But still, the fact that the sacrifice in the temple, you know, obviously the tabernacle temple period, it has to be within that period. In the culture, if you notice in the 118th, is there any ruach? No, there's no ruach. It's only nefesh. And remember, the difference between ruach and nefesh, nefesh is the breath of Adam, which was God put into Adam, which is also, by the way, the same breath he put into other animals. The nefesh is life. And in the Greek sense, since we're all Greek thinkers, right, that would be the same as tuke. And then the ruach is the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit. Yeah, the Spirit of God, which God did not put into Adam. We had to wait till later. We get the, you know, it went into the prophets. The other prophets had ruach, but the first time we hear about ruach directly being in a man is when it's in Saul. It's implied in other cases. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I just finished Judges, we're seeing the Spirit came upon Samson, the Spirit came upon, and before that, on Joshua, who's getting ready to lead Israel. Different context from what we're looking at with Saul.
I need to look at it because when we were looking at Judges, because we went through the whole Judges, right, and I can't remember, I have to look at my notes because I took the rabbi's word for it.
Right. It's fine.
Which is my fault. You know what I'm saying? What I try to do is when I try to look for sources of the information, I try not to get, number one, I don't look often at Christian sources for Old Testament stuff. I look for rabbis. I look for the Jewish view. Because who do you think is going to be more accurate? I think so, but you know, that's you know, they're interpreting their own culture, their own history, you know, and they're Hebraic speakers and thinkers. So, you know, let me go for that. So usually what I do is I look for the rabbinic view, and the rabbinic view is that Saul was the first guy that had the ruach within him. Now, that's a Talmudic view. I'm going to mention the Talmudic view that we know isn't right, or we assume is not right, okay? But it's very important to note this. But let me get, I'll go to this. There's no indications within this psalm that there's, or these psalms, or this psalm specifically, there's no indication of anything beyond life. You know, we see that, that's all the early psalms. The salvation is from death. Yeshua is from death, and the salvation is Yeshua. That's, Yeshua means salvation. There are very strong messianic ideas implied. They're not specific, but they sure sound specific in the 118th Psalm. I like that. It's pretty interesting. Tents are their homes. The word tent is very strongly in there for your home. So, okay, when are you going to put this culturally? You know, now there is, in cultures, what do we tend to look back on in cultures? What do we tend to do in cultures? For example, Little House on the Prairie. Yeah. Right? So euphemistically within Hebrew culture, it's not hard to see that they may be living in cities looking back. Little house on the prairie, little tent on the desert, okay? So, you know, are they not? I don't know. You know, I can't answer that. But, you know, this does place this, obviously if you live in a culture a long time, in a culture, city-based culture, you're not going to be longing for the tents. Well, maybe you are. You know, there's a lot of people want to live in log cabins. I'm not so sure. I know about log cabins. Any Boy Scouts? You ever slept in a log cabin and picked bugs off yourself
Not a good log cabin.
All right. I just know that as a kid I was looking up at log cabins and the walls were moving at night.
Yeah.
And it's not because my vision's obscured, okay? Now, anyway. This is likely, I'm going to place this, I'm going to say this is likely a very early psalm. You know, we could say from the time of David, from the time of Solomon. It could be earlier than that. It could be as early as, you know, the Judges period. Almost everything shows that. Now, as I've talked to you, remember Josephus and the Talmudic sources and everything says that this was strongly viewed by the rabbis, as a messianic psalm, the 118th, that points, and at some point in the psalm, the Messiah would reveal himself. That's Talmudic view. That's rabbinic view. So, that's interesting, isn't it? And then we see in John that Jesus reveals himself during that exact psalm. Okay. With that noted, let me tell you something very important. Today, the rabbis do not hold that any psalms have anything to do with the Messiah or with any prophecy. Anybody want to guess why? Conjecture why?
Gives more credence to Christ as being the Messiah.
Exactly. There was a groundswell. Remember, I've already told you about the groundswells. You know, the first groundswell was the Exodus. The second groundswell was what? What was the second big, huge groundswell in Hebraic thought? The first one was the Exodus. In the Exodus, they did what? They accepted and assimilated. They were supposed to go in and destroy. They didn't. They accepted and assimilated. That was their culture. After the Exodus, after a period, they were then brought into captivity in Assyrian Babylon. What groundswell of mental thought came out of that? Out of the exile came the idea of what? It's the place that we skip over. It's the apocryphal period. In the apocryphal period, what did they then want to do? Forced assimilation. Forced assimilation and proselytization. Coming into the New Testament era, what we don't recognize, that the Jewish thought at the beginning of the Messianic era, in the Messianic era, in the first century, was one of proselytizing. They were proselytizing the world, and it was the Pharisees that were doing it. The synagogues were proselytizing. That's why you have those 4 different groups of Gentiles. The God-fearers, remember? Cornelius, the God-fearers. Whatever's at the gates. The God-fearers, whatever at the gates, and and then there are 4 levels. There are those that are below even the God-fearers, those that are of interest that could come. There are the God-fearers, those that are studying but are not circumcised. There are the proselytes at the gates, which are those who are ready for the mikvah because they've been circumcised, but haven't been mikvahed yet. And then there are finally those that are proselytes, that have accepted Judaism and have been brought into Judaism, just like Stephen probably was. And those that were in the synagogue of the free slaves. That was where, he got in so much trouble. In any case. So they were proselytizing like crazy until what happened? The destruction of the temple and the second Jewish revolt in 125 AD. And from that point, there was a gradual change in Judaistic thought. And that gradual change, probably Rambam in the 11th, 12th century was the guy that really put the cap on it. But the part of the problem was, what were those Christians, what were those pesky Christians saying about the Psalms?
They were prophetic.
What's that?
They were prophetic.
They were prophetic, and not only that, they were messianic. And the 118th Psalm, I can point to John, and you can see that Jesus obviously announced himself during the 118th Psalm, and everything happened like Jesus said, and therefore Jesus was the Messiah. And I got a problem with that, right? If I'm Jewish community, what's the problem?
You can't look for another Messiah.
Well, I have a Messiah in every generation. So why can't you, can you see this percolating through the Jewish community? As a matter of fact, it did percolate through the Jewish community like crazy in Acts, because what does Acts say? Many priests and many Jews in Jerusalem came to know Christ. It was perking. This, it's hard to keep a good idea down. As a matter of fact, how do we know that Jesus was really born of a virgin? I mean, there's no way to prove this, right? But how do we know that that was a huge issue about Jesus being born of a virgin? There's a Talmudic story about Jesus ben Padua, about a Roman soldier named Padua. He has various names, but in some of the Talmudic sources, his name is Padua, who raped Mary and was therefore the father of Jesus. And so in the Talmudic sources, they always call Jesus Yeshua ben Padua. And this was written about 200 years after the first century. What does that show?
Attempt to discredit Christ.
It's an attempt to discredit Christ, but what does it prove?
They were definitely mindful and concerned.
It proves, number one, they're what Christ was. You don't try to discount something that isn't, right? It's a proof. It's a proof text. And number two, it's a proof text of what? That there was a question about the birth of Jesus. It was a huge question.
Well, the problem is the conception of Jesus.
Well, the conception of Christ, yeah. But it proves he was born.
Right.
And it proves that he claimed to be a Messiah, right? I mean, and it proved that he died. And he was probably resurrected. Something happened. It proves something happened. Those who say that Christ doesn't exist in other literature, or that the history doesn't prove Christ, it's like these people are nutsies. I mean, literally nutsies. It's nuts. Because there's so much, the bountiful amount of literature from the past that proves the existence of Christ is better than that proves George Washington. And I'm kidding. So it's just pretty funny to me. In any case, yeah. The question?
Has anyone attempted to do a proof text on that?
Oh, yeah.
A text to show the Jews that, hey, this doesn't stand up?
Well, it's not a question.
Legal historical argument or anything?
It's not a question showing the Jews. It's a question showing everybody. Joshua McDowell did a marvelous thing that, evidence that demands a verdict, 1 and 2. He doesn't approach it quite the way I do. He approaches it from purely a legal historical standpoint, which is a different, really neat way of approaching it. So you get the legal historical method in it. But he was a lawyer. He was a lawyer-based trained guy. So he goes from a lawyer position, which is, in legal historical method, you can bring in a lot of other facts that are different. I go for historical method only. There's a couple of other guys.
Lee Strobel wrote a book about the Case for Christ.
The Case for Christ, yes. Strobel's Case for Christ.
And there's another apologist, what's his name? He's in New Jersey.
There's a lot of it.
Really strong.
There's a lot of it out there. And so if you look, if you do a Google search, you'll probably find a huge amount, of information where people have done that. The thing is, the point that I want to make to you is right now today, the Jewish people view the Psalms, and especially the 118th Psalm, the Messiah isn't going to stand up in the temple. Number one, there is no temple. Number two, there's no sacrifice. But they view that the Psalms are not messianic and not prophetic. And the reason is because there's a whole lot of Psalms that guess who quoted? Huh? Jesus. Jesus quoted a whole bunch of Psalms specifically that he said addressed the Messiah. And guess where he was getting his information? From the Talmud.
Well, he was praying, the last one on the cross, when he was dying on the cross, he was praying in Psalm 22.
There you go. So, you know, that last groundswell in Judaistic thought, in Judaism right now, Judaic thought, you know, is basically that of isolation to a large degree.
Why don't,
Yeah.
all this has been, as you've been presenting it, if you did not want to accept Christ as the Messiah, could it not be explained that he was a fraud and very well educated in the Talmudic teachings? I mean, all I'm saying is, because he did it is not necessarily proof that he was the Messiah. It's just that he had knowledge of all of this, and he weaved it into his ministry and example. I mean, if I was gonna argue against Christ, the information you just presented would not necessarily convince me that he was the Messiah.
I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you except for a problem. You know, I probably don't have time to go through it
Sorry for
again.
bringing it up.
Oh, no, that's okay, because this is an important point. You guys remember the point I brought up many times about how a person was educated to be a follower of a rabbi, to be a rabbi. And there is no question about, for example, Paul. Paul was trained by Gamaliel, who was the rabbi of rabbis, the Rabboni, the rabbi of rabbis, which also they called Christ, okay? But they knew who his rabbi was, right? Gamaliel was the rabbi. As a matter of fact, we see in the Talmudic tracts, Paul is all over it from that period, because they call him the despised, and they call him the man without a name. They expurgated him out of the Talmud, because Paul provided a whole bunch of the arguments. That the arguments are so good that they didn't remove the arguments, they removed the arguer. See? The problem with Christ is, guess what? Nobody claimed to be his rabbi, the guy who trained him. Now that's a problem. Do you remember when he was in the temple when he was, what, 12 years old? Right? And they were amazed. Why were they amazed? I told you this before.
There's no way a 12-year-old should know all
The Mishnah, he knew the Talmud and the Mishnah.
He knew way more.
The way he asked the questions.
Taught with knowledge or taught.
Well, I doubt if he was probably teaching the way he was teaching when he was older, but the point was he was adding to their arguments. See? Because he knew, everybody knew the Torah, right? But that means he knew what? He knew the other scrolls and the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Talmudic arguments. And so he was sitting there with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and he was debating them. Debating them. You know, our impression of Jesus, right? Oh, he's just that nice little boy, so peaceful. How does that counter with the guy that took a cat of nine tails and beat people out of the temple?
Well, it does say in English that he taught with authority.
It said, but not at that point.
Well, when he was 12, I thought it did.
I don't remember if it says, did it say that?
I think
You can look
so.
it up. Anyway,
They were amazed or
Or
something.
amazed.
they were amazed. And the reason they were amazed is because, okay, you know, I would argue, and I'd love to go back through that again, you know, because doing another gospel. We did the Gospel of Matthew. I'd like to do another gospel. The Gospels are great. But one of the biggest things with that is they were amazed because he knew all these other sources. But the only way they would really be amazed in a teaching context is if he was doing what?
Basically stumping them.
He was giving them, see, they didn't, it's not question, it's not give and take in rabbinic thought. A rabbi who's fully trained makes a statement. And then all the other rabbis stand around and scratch their heads and try to figure out if they can counter that statement. So this means Jesus was making statements about the Talmud, and they couldn't
Discount.
respond and discount.
And he was just a kid from Nazareth, where was he gonna get so smart?
Right, and matter of fact, in the Arch Code documents, and you know, I've never taught the Arch Code documents, it'd be really neat to teach them. They don't have great historical credentials, but one of the Arch Code documents is the letter from Jesus's rabbi. explaining that they have Jesus, this kid who knows way more than he should, and it was written to the Sanhedrin, basically recommending they be trained as a rabbi. But there's no evidence that he was ever trained. See? I'm just saying, you know, if Jesus was trained to that level, guess what we would have?
But Lionel,
Lots of
we
data.
still, I mean, there are geniuses today that graduate from medical school at age 12. I mean, there was not someone that necessarily trained them. It's just that they had access to the material. The question to me would be, how did a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old have access to all of these scrolls and all of these teachings without a rabbi?
There's no scrolls. Remember? The Talmud wasn't written until about 100 AD. So there's no Mishnah and Talmud scrolls.
So it had to all come verbal
From somewhere.
from someone.
Okay, well, or it's innate knowledge. Okay. Now, what view have the Jews taken historically? What have they proved? Look,
They certainly provided documentation that Christ was supernatural, that he was.
bingo! Look, if I were going to disprove Christ, what I would do is I would have made up a rabbi that taught him, right? And put it in the Talmud and write all kinds of letters and say, look, you know, the Sanhedrin would have said, well, look, you trained this Jesus guy and you're a jerk and we're going to kick you out, right? If you really want to discount him. 200 years later, we get all this discounts about how he was, you know, the illegitimate child of a Roman soldier. And, you know, basically we got an Arch Code document that has his rabbi saying, I got an amazing kid here, let's train him. And the Sanhedrin basically says, no, don't touch him, don't go near him. And, you know, and Gamaliel is supposed to, the letter from Gamaliel interviewing Mary and Joseph, that's in the Arch Code documents too. Look, if you want to discount people, you don't do it by basically slandering them in stupid and illogical ways, right? So I'm just saying, look, the body of proof points to this big time.
Well, we know from the resurrection thing that the Jews were famous for making up stories. I mean, it's recorded that they said, well, we have to come up with something why there's no body. Well, I guess the disciples came and took them, and this is what you tell everybody, and they paid them or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
So, you know, that was no problem for them to generate some.
Isn't that amazing? You know? And guess what didn't get into the Talmudic sources? It made it to New Testament documents, right? Well, I mean, that'd be really bad. Yeah, we paid him off so they wouldn't say that he was resurrected. Well, you know. Maybe somebody wrote that down and they basically chopped his hand off, said, oh, you can't be saying that, guy. Anyway, I just point to you that it's the fact that they discount the Psalms is itself a proof text. That it's too close. See? Just like we saw throughout the whole Yeshua. It almost looks like, after the New Testament era, a what? A hymn to Jesus. Holy smoke. Don't you wish we did it in Hebrew? Because then we could see these direct connections. You know, maybe we should have Cohen come back, you know, and do some of the Psalms out. That may be pretty cool. I want to give you some general conclusions from the Hallel. The Hallel is not a set of common poems written at the same time. We showed that. They're obviously written at different times. Some really early, not too late though. Probably the latest I think was the 115th we looked. I can't remember exactly. The 116th, although it was early, was a very, very, very strange psalm, very different psalm, and amazing that they included it. The words and the usage in the Psalms is different. And you know, that's one study that we don't have time to do, is a word study in Hebrew. In my opinion, it's not worthless to do word studies in English. However, you have to make sure you do what if you're doing a word study in English?
Translate.
It's the same word in Hebrew. See, remember I showed you the 4 words for love in Hebrew? You know, you better make sure you got the right word for love, because otherwise you're going to have a hard time justifying, right? You know, so people need to be cognizant of that and be cautious in word studies. Even the word salvation and deliverance. Generally, almost all the time in the Old Testament documents, if you see salvation and deliverance, you can put in Yeshua, but not always. You have to be cautious. If I were translating, every time you saw salvation, it would have been Yeshua, because that's the way I think you ought to be translating this stuff. But that's my personal opinion. I don't think you ought to be changing the words. Pick one word and translate it that way, because Hebrew is very simple, relatively euphemistic, or very euphemistic, relatively simple language. You know, there's not a lot of words anyway. We ought to, you know, maybe they think it'll make the English too simple. I don't know. I don't think it would. There's too much in it. But in any case, just so we have these conclusions. Now, we're going to move on to the Great Hallel. The Great Hallel. And the words of the day, very quickly, because you've already seen these words. You know them. Olam, meaning the vanishing point, which is, well, the vanishing point is not really infinite, but it's infinite. Isn't it interesting that all these Hebraic words we have are bounded to a degree or not, or, you know, to a degree are bounded? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, for example, the word free means that you are in a large enclosed space. Right? So you are still bounded. Well, what's funny about this word olam means that the vanishing point, and it assumes eternal. Because remember, this is one of the words for time. The other word is yom. So yom means a period of time, and olam means an infinite amount of time. But there is no concept in Hebraic thought of infinity. Just like there is no concept in Hebraic thought for what? Zero had to wait a long time, 600 AD, before we got zero. There's no zero in Western thought either. We borrowed it from Arabic thought, from Arabic numbers. Zero, really cool idea. But in any case, there's no concept of infinity, there's no concept of zero. Whoa. Now, in Greek thought, there is infinity. That's one of the reasons that Greeks could... You can have philosophy if you have infinity. You can have mathematics if you have zero. It's important stuff. Sheshed, if you remember, is to bow the neck to a inferior. So, it's translated love, means kindness, grace. I don't like to use grace for it, but grace, Sheshed are about close. And that's what God shows man. This other one, I threw this in just because. And the reason I threw this in, this is a primitive participle, a particle. It's a prepositional prefix that shows a causal relationship between objects. And the reason I put this in is because the whole repetitious nature of the 136th Psalm is Ke Olam Sheshed. Ke Olam Sheshed, which means his Sheshed to the vanishing point. His, and you know, we translate it quite incorrectly, his love endures forever. That's all right. Literally, it's his or causal relationship between the first statement and the second statement, Olam Sheshed. And so that's what I put in there. And, you know, I tried to fit the whole of the 136 Hallel on here. It's 26 verses. And that's why it says, okay, I put Sheshed Olam because that's the way it is in English, but it's Olam Sheshed in any case. That's what I gave you. So each of these is repetitious. So it says in the first one, 36. This is 136, the Great Hallel. 1. Yada. Uh-oh. It doesn't even start out Hallel. It starts out Yada. Remember what's Yada? An open hand. An open hand. We translate that thanks. But what do you think they did? Put out your hand. An open hand. Or do you want to do it this way, that way, right? If you're Pentecostal, charismatic, put up like this. If you're, I guess Lutherans could do it like that. Put out open hand, right? Yada. To Yahweh.